Number 9. McDermott's Castle. Deep in County Roscommon, Ireland, on a small island in the middle of Lough Key, a 12th century castle sits in ruins. It was originally occupied by the McDermott family, who lived there for over 400 years. According to local legend, a young family member named Una Bon fell in love with a local boy from a lower class. Her father disapproved of the romance, so he put Una on the island to stop the young lovers from seeing each other. The boy began swimming to Una, but the visits were short-lived. He drowned, bringing the relationship to an abrupt end. Una eventually perished from her grief, and the two were allegedly buried side by side on the property. It's unknown whether this story is true or not, but the tale plays an integral part of the castle's folkloric history. The original structure was occupied for roughly 800 years. Around 200 years ago, its owners rebuilt it, but McDermott's castle nevertheless fell into disrepair over time, sustaining heavy damage from the ivy lining its walls. In 1899, Irish poet William Butler Yeats tried to buy the property. He hoped to restore it to its former splendor and planned to turn it into a landmark of Irish culture and heritage. Sadly, things didn't turn out quite as Yeats hoped. For years, the castle languished, and although it's since been designated as an Irish national monument, no one seems interested in taking on the restoration project. Number 8. ANADYR. Chukotka is Russia's easternmost federal subject. It's an autonomous district situated in the country's far east. Its capital, ANADYR, is Russia's easternmost town. The town is just over 100 years old, so technically, it's still fairly new. The city was founded in 1898 as Novomarinsk. During the early 20th century, in the years leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution, a revolutionary committee sent rebels Mikhail Mandrakov and Avgust Berzin to ANADYR. Their job was to establish an underground movement to undermine and ultimately overthrow anti-communist White Army troops who were stationed there. In 1919, the revolutionaries launched an attack against the White Army, which was beginning to suspect their presence. They sought to free the local indigenous people from capitalist control and from the debts that the population allegedly owed to those in power. But the rebels ultimately lost the skirmish, and sadly, they were all executed. That wasn't the end of it, however. 18 months later, the Bolsheviks returned to Novomarinsk and continued working to further establish the settlement. In the meantime, the Red Army and the rising socialist powers worked to eliminate any remaining capitalist forces in the area. In 1923, the city was declared free of White Army soldiers and renamed ANADYR. It wasn't until 1969 that an elderly resident of the city remembered where the slain revolutionaries and residents' bodies were. The remains were removed from their graves in a nearby cemetery and were reburied near monuments dedicated to the fallen. During World War II, an airfield was built at ANADYR as part of an air route for ferrying Lend-Lease supplies to Allied forces on the Eastern Front. As Cold War tensions grew following the end of World War II, the area was used for storing medium-range missiles that were pointed at US operations in Alaska. In 1994, ANADYR supposedly annexed the nearby indigenous village of Tavaivam, but modern experts doubt whether this ever actually happened, since the autonomous region was required to continue allocating separate funds for the indigenous population. Number 7. Bosnian Sphere. Semir Osmanagic is a businessman and a pseudo-archaeologist who's known for his outlandish scientific beliefs, including the claim that an unknown civilization occupied Bosnia's Visoko Valley over 1,000 years ago. He cites a giant stone sphere that he allegedly discovered in the region as evidence of the Mystery Society's existence. The eccentric explorer also argues that there are several more spheres in the forest near the town of Zavidovic, which he says once contained as many as 80 of the stone structures. Measuring somewhere between 7 and 10 feet in diameter, the sphere is allegedly the largest of its type ever discovered in Europe. This information is, of course, based on the claims of Osmanagic, who estimated that the object weighs 30 or more tons. He based his guess on the sphere's red and brown coloring, which he believes is indicative of a high iron content. Experts agree that the object is iron-rich, but they disagree with Osmanagic's belief that it's man-made. Instead, they think it's a well-known but little understood phenomena known as concretion. Scientists aren't entirely sure how concretions form, but they know that these strange spherical objects sometimes appear too perfectly round to have formed naturally. Over the course of thousands to millions of years, small mineral particles combine with sand or dirt, becoming harder than the surrounding rock. Numerous media outlets likened Osmanagish's sphere to the famous Costa Rican stone spheres, but this comparison was deceptive since the academic community believes that the Costa Rican stone spheres are man-made and that the Bosnian sphere is not. A less misleading comparison could perhaps be made between the Bosnian sphere and the Moeraki boulders, which are a series of so-called cannonball concretions found in New Zealand. What do you think? Are these spheres man-made or natural? Number 6. TYNEHAM Village. The sparsely populated countryside of southern England is home to an ancient settlement called TYNEHAM. Nicknamed Dorset's Lost Village, the former civil parish is located near the shoreline in a secluded valley. Evidence of human habitation at the site dates at least as far back as the Roman era and the Iron Age. People lived in the area until 1943, when the British government's War Office evacuated 225 residents so that the military could use the land as a firing range and training ground. Displaced residents were reassured that they would eventually be able to return to their homes, but they were never allowed back. After World War II ended, the military remained on the property. It's still used as a training ground to this day, and TYNEHAM is a ghost town. Visitors have been allowed at TYNEHAM since 1975. Many of its original buildings still stand, including the 13th century Church of St. Mary, which is made of limestone. There are also some houses and an old schoolhouse. Sadly, several structures have been destroyed or demolished. The forced relocation of TYNEHAM's former residents is heartbreaking and on some level infuriating. But one good thing did come from the diminished human presence in the area, which has become a wildlife haven even amid the military scrap that litters the property. What would you do if the government evacuated your town so it could use it as a firing range? Tell us in the comments below, and while you're at it, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about crazy abandoned discoveries. Number 5. Indonesia's earliest humans. A few years ago, archaeologists working on the small Indonesian island of Obi discovered evidence of some of the region's earliest human arrivals. They found stone tools, animal bones, and decorative beads dating as far back as 17,500 years ago. The collection also includes 11,700-year-old stone axes, as well as clamshell fragments from around 14,000 years ago. Obi is a rugged and densely forested volcanic island occupying a roughly 965 square mile area. It may have served as a stepping stone for Aboriginal people during their journey to Australia. Archaeologists believe the island may contain even older evidence of human habitation than what they've found so far, and that the artifacts waiting to be discovered could date back some 50,000 years. This was around the time when Aborigines migrated to Sahul, a supercontinent that consisted of modern-day mainland Australia and what are now the islands of Tasmania, New Guinea, Seram, and a few others. For now, Obi and the surrounding region remain largely unexplored. The most recently discovered batch of artifacts are from before the last ice age. Experts believe that Obi was abandoned around 8,000 years ago as the climate warmed, possibly because it became difficult to manage the emerging jungle of thick, dense foliage. Number 4. A real desert oasis. Deep in the Sahara Desert in southwestern Libya's Fezzan region, there's a dormant volcano or caldera known as Wa'an Namus, or Oasis of Mosquitoes. It's roughly 2.5 miles wide and 330 feet deep and surrounded by a 6 to 12 mile wide deposit of dark ash that contrasts against the surrounding yellow desert. There's a nearly 400-foot cinder cone on the floor of the extinct volcanic crater, as well as 3 vivid salt lakes and some smaller bodies of water surrounded by palms, reeds, and other vegetation. Some of the water bodies are fresh, making the so-called Oasis of Mosquitoes an important stopping point along caravan routes to oases further south. The site gets its name from the abundance of mosquitoes that the waters attract. They don't hesitate to bite, especially since they rarely get the opportunity to sample humans. Visitors are strongly reminded to remember their bug spray and are forewarned that they'll need to bring mosquito nets if they plan to camp within the caldera. People from outside the region first learned of Wa'an during the late 19th century. The first European to visit is thought to be a French military officer named Laurent Lapierre, who saw the site when he was taken captive during combat in 1920. Scientists are unsure of the dormant volcano's exact age. Some of its features indicate that it's relatively young and that it may have formed as recently as 1,000 years ago. But it's also possible that the arid climate is masking the effects of time, and that it's older than it seems. In general, volcanism in the Sahara is a little understood topic that needs a lot more research before experts can state many facts with confidence. Number 3. Fort Boyard. In the Strait of Antioch, between France's Axe and Oléron Islands, there's a small castle-like structure called Fort Boyard. It was built after King Louis XIV proposed the idea of a fort in the middle of the water during the 17th century. He suggested placing it off the coast of western France as a way to protect the country amid ongoing disputes with England, but the project proved to be too costly and the plans were abandoned. Construction resumed in 1801 under Napoleon Bonaparte, but soon proved disastrous as changing tides made it impossible for workers to set the foundational stones. Nonetheless, the building continued until 1809, when the project was paused. It remained on hold until 1830, when Louis Philippe became the King of France. Fort Boyard was finally finished in 1858, over a century and a half after the idea was originally conceived. Ironically, by then, it was no longer strategically useful. Cannon technology had improved enough for France to defend itself from the mainland, rendering the fort obsolete. The completed structure measures 330 feet by 160 feet. It is 66 feet tall. The ground floor consists of food storage and sleeping quarters for 250 occupants. Weapons and ammunition were kept on the upper levels. Fort Boyard saw little use over the next 130 years, and at some point, it began to fall rapidly into disrepair. Renovations began in 1988. Starting 2 years later, the site was used in a long-running Survivor-style reality TV show. Would you be interested in participating in a reality show that takes place in a dilapidated French fort? Let us know in the comments below. Number 2. Skellig Michael Monastery. 7 miles off the coast of County Kerry, Ireland, there's a remote, rugged island called Skellig Michael. It's considered one of the country's most unique destinations, in part because it's home to an ancient monastery that was established back during the 6th century. Perched on a cliff 600 feet above sea level, the monastery was first mentioned in an 8th century chronicle of Ireland's history called the Annals of Innisfallen. Vikings began attacking the site in the year 824. Then, sometime during the 11th century, a church dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel was built there. The site also contains 2 oratories, a cemetery, several crosses, and 6 stone beehive-shaped huts. There were no more than 12 monks and 1 abbot living at the Skellig Michael at any given time. The site was continuously inhabited until sometime during the 12th or 13th century. On the other side of the island, there's a 9th century hermitage filled with cells and platforms that were once used by monks who dedicated themselves fully to their worship by living in complete isolation. The island is open to tourists and can be reached via a 1-hour boat ride, but it often involves traveling through some pretty rough waters. It is not ideal for the easily frightened or seasick. Number 1. The SALTMEN of Iran. Around 300 AD, more than 1700 years ago, in what is now Iran, a group of men were crushed to death when the roof of the mine they were working in collapsed. Their remains were finally discovered in 1993, when miners at the modern-day Cherabad salt mine in Zanjan province found the first body. It belonged to a man who sported long flowing white hair and a gold earring. His remains didn't look nearly as old as they were proven to be through radiocarbon dating. Experts believe that the dry environment helped to preserve the body, while the surrounding salt sucked moisture out of his skin, naturally mummifying the man. 5 more so-called saltmen have been discovered since then. The second mummy was found in 2004, just 50 feet from where the first one appeared. 2 more saltmen were found the following year in 2005. The last 2 were discovered in 2007, and one of them actually turned out to be a woman, much to the surprise of the experts. Mining came to an end at the site in 2008. The same year, the property was declared an archaeological site, making it available to researchers for the first time. They've learned a lot from the mummies, some of which are so incredibly well preserved, their internal organs remained intact upon discovery. One man's stomach even contained tapeworm eggs, indicating that he ate a lot of raw and undercooked meat. The salt helped to preserve other artifacts, including a leather boot with a foot inside, some iron knives, a pant leg, a silver needle, a sling, a leather rope, pottery shards, textile fragments, a walnut, and more. 4 of the 6 mummies are currently on display in the exact positions they were found in at the Archaeology Museum in Zanjan. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn about more amazing discoveries in remote places, let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. See you next time. Bye!